So, hello, I'm with Jamie Woodhouse from Sentientism, and this is the first podcast that I record for this initiative, Conviction Helps Thrive. Uh, Jamie Woodhouse is someone that I, for a long time, wanted to work with because he has founded this initiative that is based on evidence and reason to reach compassion and empathy. So I think that he will probably be someone better to explain what his concept is like and why it correlates with what I'm doing here. He just read my book, The Jackson's Debate, which is the central reason for the overarching project that I have. So, hello, Jamie.
Hey Marcus, how are you? It's brilliant to be here, and it's a real honor to be your first guest too. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Could you explain, like, for the listener, what sentientism is like, how it started, and how you might think that it correlates to what is discussed in the book?
yeah, of course. So I summarize sentientism as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. But it might be better to explain, what sort of thing it is, and I describe it as a worldview. Um, and for me, a worldview is just like the absolute basic foundation of how we think about the world. How do we believe things? What do we believe? Um, what matters ethically? Who matters ethically? Those really, really deep questions. So if you ask someone, why do you believe this? Or why is this right or wrong? And you keep asking why, I think right at the bottom is their worldview. So lots of people have quite an explicit worldview. So, we're familiar with religious worldviews: Islam, Judaism, Jainism, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, the list goes. So lots of people are quite familiar with those as a type of worldview that they explicitly sign up to, if you like. There are also non-religious worldviews like humanism, for example, which says, look, let's take a broadly scientific way of understanding the world. We don't think it's likely that supernatural stuff exists, but we don't need a God to be good. We can just, choose to be ethical and care about at least all other humans. So there's non-religious worldviews as well. But then lots of other people don't really have an explicit worldview. So if you'd say to them, what is your worldview? They might look at you and shrug and say, I don't know what you're talking about. But I think even they do have a worldview. There's still some foundation for what they choose to believe and how they think about morality and ethics, even if it's not that explicit. So I put sentientism as another sort of choice on that menu of worldviews as just a way of thinking. So just to reiterate, it's sort of answering the same deep questions that many other worldviews are trying to answer. What's real? What should we believe? How should we believe? And what and who matters? And sentientism's answer is, when we think about how to understand the universe, we should be humble, we should be open-minded, but basically we should use evidence and reason in a good faith attempt to try and understand what's true. So beliefs and credences. And of course, when the reasoning and the evidence changes in a convincing way, we should be ready to change our minds and update. So it's anti-dogmatic. We never get stuck in a belief. We're always open-minded, always uncertain, but we use evidence and reasoning. And on the ethical side, it's quite open-minded about which type of ethics we apply and what sort of morality there is. And we might get into those different choices later on. But it says whatever your ethics are, every sentient being should matter and should matter seriously. And a
Yeah,
sentient
that
being,
that
yeah,
that's what I wanted to get into. So this is a part where I think it's the most difficult to explain. So when I want to explain it to people, I kind of feel like I struggle a bit, which is why sentientism, beings that are sentient, is what matters to base all the worldview around it. Because having evidence and reason to sustain your thoughts and how you view the world is one thing, but having it to support that who are sentient and who is not. But why should people care about the sentient beings? Because the way I feel like we are in the world, people, their worldview, at least most of people, would be that humans are in the center, and those are the ones that we should care about. So why should we think that we should change those humans to expand it to all sentient beings? Why should that be?
yeah. A simple way of answering it is that we should care about sentient beings because they care about themselves, they have experiences, they have interests, they have feelings that matter to them. And in a very common sense understanding of morality, which is that morality is about whether and how we care about others, I think those sentient beings, and a sentient being is any being that can experience things, that can feel things, particularly good things, which we might call flourishing, or
Yeah,
bad things, which we might call suffering. So that's the core of it, is if you have a common sense morality that is about whether and how we care about others, caring about others is about caring how they feel, then
yeah.
sentient being is any being that feels anything at all. So that's, I guess that's a
I
simple
think
way of answering
this
it.
very well articulated answer of yours is probably what most people would like to respond. If the question was, why should we care about humans? They would probably say that humans care about themselves and they have their subjective experience. It's just that I don't feel like it was, uh, it is a general thought of people that there are more to it than only humans, that other beings care about themselves. And people might not know because they might not be interested, that evidence supports that most beings are sentient. Like it's very clear for most that have a dog that they have some type of subjective experience going on, but they don't go as deep as to think that they should be like society should change the way it behaves because of the dog. So I think that the convincing part is kind of the hardest part to like convince how society will behave from now on. So that's probably what you've been trying to do with your organization, and that's a bit of what I try to do with my book. So let me explain why the book came about, because in that being so hard to do, and I was kind of involved with animal rights and trying to show people that their humans shouldn't be in the center of our moral compass. There should be more to it. More beings should be considered. And if we look at it, they are very, very bad treated in society. Like we go to the point, I consider the chicken example to be very emblematic, just because most chickens are born just to be our food source, which is crazy. They don't get even to have life experience. They are born like they are completely commodified, and there are many more chickens in a year than there are humans. So it's probably something a lot around 25 billions per year. So their life expectancy is 3 years. So it's 3 months. So that's totally crazy. So trying to explain it in like an academic way or just saying these things that we're saying here is probably not enough, because many have done it. So Peter Singer has started this whole discussions in the 70s, and it probably goes back to it, goes
It
back
goes,
much
yeah, I mean,
further.
it goes hundreds, even thousands of years earlier than that. But he obviously made a major contribution to bringing it into the certain parts of the modern world. Yeah,
Yeah, so the book is kind of removing humans from this position of taking the decision of having their own worldview determining what will happen. So I wanted to make those aliens very evidence based and logical based, and also I wanted to make them consider themselves to be ethical type of beings and compassionate type of beings, just because that's what I think that most humans consider themselves to be. They like to think themselves as ethical beings, and still like in the reality we are kind of provoking all those types of outrageous things to other beings. So I wanted those aliens to actually really feel like they were ethical, but even if they were considering themselves ethical, they were causing all those harm to humans. They don't actually do it in the book, but they consider it. And
yeah,
I think considering is more, can be more impactful than actually if they were to make it, because like it's kind of an introspective feeling of reading those aliens, just considering the possibility.
yeah. And I thought that was one of the things that was fascinating about the book, is because you don't hear the human side of the story at all. You don't really hear from humans. Occasionally, you'll hear what the Jacksons, say the humans say or think, but you never get to hear from the humans directly. And that's quite an interesting analogy to the way we often treat non-human animals. We'll say that they can't speak, but actually, in reality, we're just ignoring their very obvious expressions sometimes. And as you say, anyone who has a companion animal in their home, they communicate richly in many ways. They might not speak English, but the communication is rich. There's a behavior of reinforcement and joy and love and resistance and anger. And, it's there for us all to see. And anyone who's watched any footage of animal agriculture at any stage through the process will see clear communication, acts of resistance that are just ignored. So it was really interesting in the book that we as humans are in that position where our voice is just not heard, or if it is heard, it's not taken seriously, or it's elided, or it's just caught up in some other type of being, some other type of powerful being's consideration that we cannot influence.
Yeah, that was totally intentional. It's just because that's what actually happens here. So I wanted to make this a real parallel to how we are, so that even though I will not tell you to think that we are doing it, you will automatically go, hang on, isn't it what we are kind of doing to the other beings in here?
Yeah.
And I I I imagine it feels like while you're reading the book, there will be a point in which you will get to see what's happening in the earth, but it just doesn't appear in there. And they don't actually like do anything bad to humans, because that's one thing that I thought that was very common. Like if you look, go on vegan communities, you will see like they sharing images of farm water slaughterhouses and things like that, just for the impact in the eye that it makes you kind of change your mind. And I think that many people change the way they go about their life because of those videos they see. But I wanted to make something more introspective. Like you don't need to be shocked by what you see to change your perspective. And what I want to make very clear is that I don't consider myself to be the most compassionate of persons, or the most empathetic of persons. I'm not a person who will go and watch a movie about what happens to animals or certain parts of the world and cry about it, or be thinking about it for so long. Of course, I get affected by it, but it's not. I know of people like that will like cry and have difficulty in going in about their lives because they will be too concerned about it. And I think that many of those people are likely to be convinced by vegan movements and those type of movements, because it's all based on compassion. But I ended up being like, I consider myself an advocate for animal rights, but just because I think that it doesn't make sense. Like, we consider that we are trying to shape an ethical society, and based on science, like everything we do is kind of all developments in society is based on evidence and science and what it kind of directs us. And we know that animals have their subjective experience, at least some of them. And I don't want to get into who has it and who's not, because it does get complicated. But if we go on like a chimp, for example, they in some places of the world they are used as laboratory testing, and that's just unacceptable. It wouldn't be unacceptable to humans. And one argument that I don't know if you counter the same way that I do is that some people will be like, why are you concerning yourself in advocating for animals if humans have so many problems? They haven't surpassed famine yet. They have disease. They're affected by all those kind of things. So my response to that would probably be that it's not that I'm not concerned about these problems. They are very important and they need to be addressed, but they won't necessarily substitute each other. And it's also that it's not agreed in society that this is a good thing. Everybody wants to change it. So everybody is trying to change it, in theory at least. The animal situation is very different. Nobody is trying to change it. And if there are people trying to change it, they are a small minority. So the first step is recognizing that the way we're going about certain things is wrong. And that's what I'm trying to show with the book and you with your movement. So what is your take on the response to that question that
So
people might
I
have?
think that's a good response. And the other thing I would say is that this sentientism idea does leave space for prioritization, and it leaves space for people to choose their own focuses and their own causes and the things they can do in their lives, because people have very different capacities and levels of privilege and wealth and time to try and make the world a better place. Some people are just in a survival situation, trying to struggle and get by with their family. So our capacity to do things in the world is extremely variable. And whatever capacity we have to do good, people will choose and should be allowed to choose to prioritize where they like. So what the worldview instead tries to do is, instead of saying, here's the perfect answer, everyone should go and work on this thing, or here's an order of things you should do, solve racism first, then solve sexism, then solve speciesism, then solve, whatever it is, right? Global poverty and working through it. It doesn't do that at all, but it does try and set a baseline for moral consideration. So it says, look, every sentient being warrants moral consideration, right? And as you said, you can get to that through a sort of emotional path, if you like, or you can get to it through a more intellectual path where you're thinking logically, you want to have a consistent, coherent ethic, and maybe you don't feel the emotional pull in quite the same way, but you want to have a basically rational ethics and it leads you to the same place. So every sentient being should get moral consideration. And for moral consideration to be meaningful in any sense, right? And this applies to the words compassion, humane, caring, right? For the word care in any minimal sense to have meaning, there should be a baseline for our treatment. And the baseline I suggest is technically called non-maleficence, which basically means, I would not exploit, harm, or kill you without a really serious overriding justification. So if I was to say to you, Marcus, you're a sentient being, I have moral consideration for you. I'm not going to prioritize you because I've got a load of other things going on in my life, my family, my friends, other causes I'm working on. I'm not necessarily even going to go out of my way to help you if you need help. But at the very least, Marcus, I at least won't needlessly exploit, harm, or kill you. I think you'd say, well, that's not very impressive, Jamie, but that is at least a baseline. Whereas if I was to say, I care about you, Marcus, I grant you moral consideration, but I will now needlessly exploit you for some sort of trivial reason, you'd say to me, no, 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 you can't claim you care about me. You can't claim you have moral consideration for me and still needlessly want to exploit or harm me. Those things are just not consistent. So it tries to set that baseline. So in that context, sentientism isn't saying you have to prioritize non-human animals, or you have to prioritize this group, or you have to prioritize that group. But it does say, while you're prioritizing those other things and while you're working on them, you should at least do what you reasonably can, seriously, to avoid exploiting, harming, or killing any sentient being at all. Right. So I'm not saying change your positive focus, change your cause, but at least don't cause the negative harms. At least don't breach the negative rights of any sentient being to the extent you can. And I think it's analogous in the human justice cause space, right? So if someone is saying, I'm really working on supporting trans rights and fighting transphobia, so I'm not spending as much time on countering sexism or racism or casteism or lookism or some other form of discrimination, ageism or classism, right? Because I'm focusing on trans rights as my cause, we wouldn't say stop doing that and go do something else, but we would expect that person, while they're working on their chosen cause, not to be racist or sexist or casteist or discriminate or harm others. So I think it's a similar sort of context. We're not saying you can't prioritize, you can't choose, but as you're going out to try and have a positive impact in the world, at the very least, there should be a baseline expectation, as we do with universal human rights, that while you're working on your cause, you don't undermine the other causes and you don't explicitly carry out some forms of oppression while you're resisting your chosen type of oppression. Does that make sense? And I think we can extend that out into the sentientism world, because you could absolutely still, if you like, continue to focus on human causes if that was what you want to do. But at the same time, you cannot be a part of continuing the oppression of non-human sentient beings, because they matter too. So that's my sort of slightly long rambling response to that
And no,
choice,
no matter
that challenge.
how what you're doing, or what uh, aspect of society you're trying to improve, it doesn't change the fact that the non-human situation is dire at the moment, and there's no point in trying to. And you can
And we can
you
still,
you
and we can absolutely have those, and we should have those conversations about prioritization and rationality. And loads of people do that sort of stuff and say, look, this cause is actually more important. These beings are more numerous. These beings are more serious. Those are good conversations to have. But what
Yeah.
I
Uh,
so and we should have them, but I think setting the baseline is, if anything, more important.
w-
It's like a
one could
platform
go
on which we
about
can then have those conversations about priority.
Yeah, one could go about a different social cause from a sentientist perspective, from sentientist worldview. So, for example, one could be vegan from a sentientism causing a person to be vegan, while other person could be vegan but coming from a totally different direction. And we talked about that people becoming vegan because of their religion, which is nothing to
Yeah,
do with the pathway sentientism kind of directs you to go, but you kind of end up in the same place.
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
And some of the, I was hinting earlier on when you mentioned Peter Singer, right? There is this sort of vibe sometimes in the animal movement that it was invented in the 19th century by a small group of people in Oxford. That's just, they did really important, serious work that has helped position various aspects of the movement in a better way now. But they're building on truly ancient ideas. So if you go into the Dharmic religions and look at the idea of ahimsa as an example, which simply means, non-violence or doing no harm, that never meant do no harm to humans. It meant do no harm at all to any being that can be harmed, and a being that can be harmed is a sentient being. So yeah, these are really ancient, rich ideas that I think probably go back to the roots of humanity itself, that we're now trying to build on and take seriously. And I think so. So there's absolutely common cause. You could come to compassion for non-human animals through an enlightened view of Christian stewardship and recognizing that Garden of Eden was vegan and there probably won't be any slaughterhouses in heaven, right? So you can take a Christian approach that gets you to a sentiocentric compassion. You could take an ahimsa-based dharmic approach that again gets you to the same place from a religious context. Within Islam, there are rules about compassion and cleanliness and respect and even you know active animal advocacy that can take you to the same place. And sentientism in a way is just another path to that similar sentiocentric compassion that has a naturalistic, broadly scientific worldview rather than a religiously oriented one. So there's absolute commonality and common cause of people of all sorts of different worldviews on this collective idea about sentiocentric compassion for all sentient beings. And I think the only other thing I'd say about the response to this, you know let's focus on human priorities first, right? Again, an idea we would never accept for intra-human causes. No one would say you have to perfectly fix all of racism before you start on sexism. That would be insane, right? Um, but the additional thing I'd say is that it's really convenient that expanding our moral scope actually benefits those who are doing the expanding in the first place. So we've seen that in the human sphere. I think actually the move towards human rights, at least as an aspiration, right, one which we're failing on every day, but at least we've made the aspiration, has been good, even for those privileged groups that were in a lucky position before that work started. So extending your moral scope out benefits you. And this is absolutely true when it comes to non-human sentient beings, because if you're worried about human causes like climate change, like food security, like zoonotic disease, like water and air pollution, like land use, like deforestation and the potential for reforestation, like the opportunities for rewilding, like biodiversity loss, like emissions, CO2 and M2O and CH4, if those are some of your human concerns and you're worried about exploitative conditions of workers, and, I could go on, right? If those are things that concern you because you're worried about humans, I have some great news for you in that extending our moral scope to all sentient beings and in essence, ending their exploitation, particularly through agriculture, conveniently is a win-win for humans and our shared environment too. So it just happens to be, a lucky chance that you can win on all fronts by extending our moral scope to other sentient beings too, in so many myriad ways. It's not even a trade-off. It's not a sacrifice. It's not something we have to
Yeah.
necessarily give up, right? It's even from a purely selfish human lens, extending our moral scope to other sentient beings makes
Yeah,
sense.
I just feel like the substituting and trade-off arguments just lazy, and it kind of sticks to some people because this is kind of this topic that we're talking about. It's not so often that people hear others talking about. So this is kind of their first experience with this topic. It might be a comedian like just making a mockery joke and will say something like that. Oh, so you're concerned about animals. What about the children? And they will kind of phrase it in a funny way. And this will probably be the only experience like some person had with this sort of topic, and it might be what sticks with the person because unfortunately this is not a subject that is in the main agenda, so it's not talked about so much. So and I think that we should be um, a little protective of the bubble effect because like if I look at my LinkedIn, it feels like this is such a big cause, but if you look at the real world, this is not as discussed as it should be. But one thing I was
But
considering,
it's
like
but at the same time, I think it's interesting because one of the things that gives me hope, going back to your earlier point, is that in a weird way, most humans already agree with us in theory, right? So as you said earlier on, if you really ask people, okay, why do do you believe in universal human rights? Do you believe all, living humans matter? And they will say, yes, of course I do. And you'll say, well, why do you care? And some might say, oh, it's because we're all human. And you're like, yep, okay, but why do you actually care about those individuals? And you dig down. I think many of them will come back to, they might not use the word sentience, but that's what they're talking about. Is because, oh, because I know you can feel things, right? You feel sad, you feel happy, you feel pain. That's what I care about. So in a way, most humans, I think deep down, do care about other humans because those other humans are sentient beings. It's not because we just happen to have some sort of species solidarity or species membership, right? That
I,
is as arbitrary as selecting the people you care about based on sex or race or gender or sexuality, right? So there is that sentience is actually the characteristic that I think drives most into human compassion. And most humans already go beyond the human. Again, you mentioned earlier on, if people have a dog or a cat as a member of their family and they care about them deeply as a family member because of their sentience, they care about their pain, their hunger, their thirst, their happiness, they've already gone beyond the human boundary. They already care about non-human sentient beings. So in a way, we're just saying, well, if you want to be consistent and coherent, then care about them all. So that does give me hope because although our cultures are very sort of anthropocentric in one sense, right, very focused on humans, almost every human has already gone beyond that boundary. And almost every human cares about other humans, not because we're the same species, but because we're sentient. So there's some hope there as well, I think. And often the
yeah,
dark heart of the problem is in human psychology and sociology and the history of the things we've come to think of as normal. Um, it's not actually a deep philosophical disagreement often.
we could say that sentientism, I'm not completely sure how to state it that way, but sentientism is kind of the reason behind believing in universal human rights. So, but it would be kind of a sentientism for humans. Like humans have their subjective experience, so we should care about them. But people, I don't think they think about it in that way. They just kind of it's kind of they are hardwired into believing that they do believe in universal human rights, but they don't go beyond. They don't question themselves. That's why philosophy is important, so that you know why you believe in the things you believe and why you think things that way. So most people won't be kind of questioning themselves those kinds of questions most of the time, at least. But one
And
thing that
the difficulty is that I think a lot of people, we're all subject to this risk, right? We all do it to some degree. We do philosophy backwards. So instead of starting from the foundations, what's real and who matters, and really then working that through to the implications, we instead start from basic assumptions that are things like I'm a good person, my family and friends are good people, we are good people, the things we do must be good, and then you work backwards from there to justify those. And that can lead you to warping the things you believe, and it can lead you to warping your ethics and excluding some beings from your moral consideration. So I think that's the difficulty. Many people's philosophical thinking is driven backwards from the implications and from the things they are already doing and they're already believing, rather than having the bravery to sort of start from the basics, work through to the implications, and then face those honestly. I mean, it's hard to do because we are social beings, and being considered normal by our friends, family, and peers, for many people, until you examine it, is more important than finding the truth or doing what's right. And And we need to have empathy for each other in struggling through that because, we are an evolved, weird type of social ape, right? So,
Yeah.
we're all struggling with this to varying degrees. Yeah.
Yeah, but so I knew that we would record this podcast from last week. So I was like thinking more through the sentientism concept, and I feel like I totally subscribe to the idea. I wouldn't call myself a sentientist just because I didn't know that, like I don't know, 2 months ago, so 3 months ago, something like that. So it's not enough for me to like call this my ideology. I don't know, but it
And it's
feels
there's
like
an
I
important
completely subscribe to it.
well, it's lovely to hear that. And I think an important point to make is there are some people who do actually like it as an ism and as an identity and as a label, right? So there are people on Blue Sky and Twitter who might put it in their bio and say, I am a
Hmm.
sentientist, and use it as a way of explaining, who they are and how they think. And I do workshops in schools where I talk about the sentientism worldview and present it. But there are lots and lots of other people who don't like the idea of identities in general. They don't, the last thing they want is another ism to sign up to. They just are nervous of isms, right? And I deeply respect that way of thinking as well. And I will often say to people, this is just a way of thinking. It's a worldview. You don't have to change who you are. You don't have to sign up to an identity. You don't. There's no membership. There's no expectation, there's no constraint, there's no control, right? It's just a way of thinking. So whether you want to call yourself a sentientist or not, whether you like isms or don't, doesn't matter. The most important thing you know, is your epistemology well grounded, the way you think about what to believe, and do your ethics include all of the valid moral patients, all the sentient beings? That's what really matters, much less the ism or the branding or the identity. But
Yeah, yeah. I personally would probably fall into that bracket of someone who doesn't want to have one more ism to follow through.
we have
Probably
so
because
many,
like
yeah.
yeah, and probably because it gives you a responsibility and an expectation of how you will behave. So if you say you were just that, you follow that dogma, people will expect you to do certain things. So not sure. And uh I feel like evidence and reason is kind of good way to come from because it won't have you like you are just acting from the evidence you come across and you kind of are convinced by it. It's not that you believe, it's that you are convinced. But coming to the evidence discussion, I wanted to say that even though I consider regarding sentient beings and non-human rights, the Sentientism, probably the best worldview that I have come across. I wouldn't say that this is bulletproof to not causing no harm to other sentient beings, because there might be that there is an avoidability of harm in nature. So, for example, we are humans, and we are kind of at this moment trying to cross this threshold in which we're trying to not to cause no harm. But for example, if you're a lion, there's no other way of living without causing harm to other beings. So nature is kind of shaped in that way, where harm is kind of intrinsic and ingrained into the way it operates. And we as humans, we have established an ethical worldview, and we are trying to surpass it. So sentientism, we could say that is trying to make a world that there is no harm caused to other beings. Is that
Well,
possible? I'm not sure
yeah,
if this is an alternative.
I'm not sure if that's what it is trying to achieve, because it's another area where I think you can ask the same question of human ethics, right? So in human ethics, whether we have a rights-based perspective or in some way, shape, or form we care about all humans, what we're saying there is humans have interests, they have rights that should protect those interests. All humans matter. But are there still some, what one, is it possible to never cause any harm to a human and for our systems to operate in a way? It's pretty unlikely, right? It
Yeah,
feels like in a complex world, there's always going to be some harm. So having perfection as a standard, I think, is sometimes a dangerous thing. And also, even in human ethics, sometimes harming, constraining, or even killing other humans is actually justified. It can be the right thing to do, right? Because you might have compassion for the potential victims of someone. So or the past victims of someone. So you might need to act to harm a perpetrator to prevent them harming victims, for example. And we absolutely accept that within the human sphere. So just as human ethics isn't about completely eradicating any harm or suffering, and as just as human ethics does leave the door open, if you're careful in good faith for justifying harming and constraint and even killing, a sentiocentric perspective can do the same thing. So all it says is every sentient being should be seriously morally considered. It does not say we must do everything to eradicate all suffering. It doesn't set a particular perfectionist end state or a target or a demand. It just says that in our ethical thinking, as we work through all of these really complex, difficult problems, every sentient being should matter seriously as we struggle with these issues. But it is, you're right, it's not bulletproof, it's not perfect, it does not answer every question, it doesn't resolve every moral trade-off. It leaves so much complexity to work on. All it's really trying to do is set a baseline to say that no sentient being should be ignored or excluded as we're trying to work that stuff out. And looking
Yeah,
at nature is a really challenging example of that, because that's one area where many people who are, for example, animal advocates or vegans are completely understandably and rightly focused on the human caused harms, the human caused harms in farming, in agriculture, in slaughterhouses, in labs, in entertainment, in other forms of animal exploitation, right? So they're very focused on the human-caused harms, but sentientism says, well, and the reason you're doing that as animal advocates and vegans is ultimately because you think those non-human animals have rights, they have interests, you respect them, you have moral consideration for you, you care about them, right? That's why we want to end the human-caused harms. But if we have those moral consideration for the beings that are being harmed by humans, sentientism challenges us to say, well, we should also have moral consideration for the beings that are living free range or in the wild, whether or not they're impacted by humans. Now, of course, many of them are because of climate change and because of deforestation and loads of other things we're
yeah,
doing,
kind of indirectly.
but indirectly. But even so, nature, before humanity even evolved, had an enormous amount of flourishing and suffering and many,
Yeah.
many hundreds of billions, trillions, quadrillions of sentient beings before humans even existed. And all of those beings mattered even before humans existed, and they still matter today. And what to do about that is a really difficult, complex ethical challenge that humanity hasn't even started to seriously think about. There are some great thinkers doing work on that. And I don't think there are easy answers. But the key is that we don't exclude any of the beings, the sentient beings, at all.
Yeah, it's something that gets me concerned about life when I look at what happens with so many beings out there and how stupidly sometimes beings die in a horrendous way, suffering insurmountable amount of suffering going through those type of beings. So just thinking of on how many dolphins would, for example, die drowned just because they didn't find a place to breathe. So how what might be this intrinsic experience that this dolphin, this individual dolphin might be having, and it's not because of someone, it's just because nature operates in that way weirdly that some beings suffer this high level of suffering. So that's something that I consider very difficult to reconcile with, and it's something about nature. So I try to explore it in the book because like made this ideal society. So in this ideal society, they they kind of extracted the suffering from their world, the little world in which they live. So they do interact with other beings less developed than they are, but they still made their lives much better. So they kind of changed their environment, but always for good. And they're always like, but they have to feed themselves of something, and still they consider that it might be that they're causing some suffering. So the unavoidability of causing suffering to other beings is something that does concern me, because even even if we are to like let's say that artificial generated meat is the solution for the world, will it mean that we will live in a world without causing suffering just because of like the way that society is structured? It might be that it's not just not possible. There are some trade-offs uh, ingrained into the way we go about it. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's
And I
very
think
complex.
it is very complex. And again, I think there's a psychological danger that particularly for people who are into philosophy, we seem to have this unfair expectation on ourselves that, we as an individual evolved ape should have some perfect answer to all of these problems. And I think part of having some, I mean, and it's good we have that aspiration, right? I think that's a wonderful thing that we try to go way beyond, the purposes we evolved for and try to make the world better. But we also need to be a little bit humble about our ability to do that. Be a bit easier on ourselves. And in the wild animal space, I think it's fascinating because I think there's a lot of flourishing and positive experiences out there. I interviewed a philosopher called Heather Browning who's done some work on this stuff. And she's like, look, don't underestimate how much positive experience there is out in the world. But at the same time, you're absolutely right. There is catastrophic, horrific suffering out there too, right? Nature, a lot of people have this thing called a naturalistic fallacy where you think nature is by definition good and wonderful and maybe even perfect. But actually, nature, while we might aesthetically appreciate it, while we might regret the harm humanity has done to nature, itself is brutally amoral. So if you're a being that's living in nature, free ranging, things might go well for you, but they might go very badly. So there are classes of animals which have, for example, reproductive strategies where it's very different from, how us as mammals operate, where the strategy is have 10,000 kids or 100,000 kids or a couple of million kids, right? And out they go into the world. And the reason I have that many kids as a reproductive strategy that has evolved is because 0.3% of them will survive and all of the others will die. And we might hope that because they die so young, maybe that there's such an early stage of their developmental life cycle that they're not sentient or they haven't achieved sentience yet or their sentience is absolutely minimal, but maybe they are, right? So maybe as a child of one of these animals, you might have a 5 in a million shot of surviving to then struggle, or you might die a painful death from predation, from starvation, from thirst, from illness, right? So, I mean, this is another thing that is extremely difficult for the human mind to get their head around. And as an aside, it's another reason why I'm very skeptical that a benevolent God exists, because there's this thing called the problem of evil that most people think of just in
Yeah,
human terms, right? Where, a child suffering with bone cancer or a natural disaster, or there's so much human suffering that we struggle to understand a rationale for, that people would then say, well, that's the problem of evil. It makes me less likely to believe in a benevolent God. But when you think about the amount of directly needless suffering that is unrelated to human choices that happens just out in the
yeah.
wild,
Before
and
humans existed.
for probably 500 million years before humans even evolved, yeah, I'm really struggling to see how a benevolent, all-powerful, all-knowing God would have
Yeah,
created this world. So just as a tangent, but I should come back to your point, which is, okay, what the hell do we do about it? And I don't know the answer. I think the baseline, there are some people, and I've interviewed some of them, like David Pearce, who have a really interesting sort of high-tech view of a potential future where maybe with the help of AI and genetic engineering and maybe cultivated meat that you could feed to the lions, we could get to some future state where we've actually, in a benevolent way, re-engineered the biosphere to radically reduce the amount of suffering within it. Now, many people respond to that with horror because humanity has got such a terrible track record of intervening in nature that it just feels like crazy hubris, and I completely understand that. But there, you can go to the other extreme of saying, well, okay, there are pragmatic, safe, low risk interventions where we're really confident that we might be able to help wild animals. And that could be as simple as, in my local community here, there was an injured goose that someone found on the street that had been hit by a car, and they took them to a sanctuary and got them helped, right? That's helping, you know, wild animals. There are wildlife corridors. There are ideas about vaccination, which are normally done for selfish human reasons because of zoonosis, but
yeah, yeah,
can benefit the animals. There are feeding practices. You can use fencing or contraception instead of culling. And to be honest, quite often with culling, you need to ask why that's being done in the first place. So there are lower, much less scary positive interactions that actually we're already experimenting on that can help animals in the wild. And it's a drop in the ocean of the suffering. But so I don't know the best answer, and I don't think anyone would pretend they do have the best answer. We should be prudent, we should be cautious, we should be very skeptical of us
yeah.
humans because of our
So
track record.
it's
But the key thing is that baseline that whatever we choose to do or not do, every one of those sentient beings still matters. We must not use the complexity or the difficulty of a practical problem as a reason to exclude those beings from our moral consideration. Even if we choose to do nothing to help, they still matter, and that suffering still matters, and their interest in having a long, happy life still matters. Whatever our
Yeah.
choices are.
When I was writing the book, I had just read Martha Nussbaum.
Yeah,
I think in 2021 she wrote a book about for animals justice, something like that. So it's kind of big book, and she goes on those kind of difficult topics of should we intervene in nature, should we not? Because like I think that standard approach would be that nature is good the way it is and we should leave nature away, but is that even possible? So that's a totally different discussion. I might have some positions on that, but it's interesting that sentientism can have all those point of views encompassed in their way of life. So you might have seen that like in chapter 5, I kind of explained the way the aliens see the world, and I inspired myself from the capabilities approach from Martha Nussbaum. So they
yeah,
they not only want to the way they view the world is not they not only want all beings to survive and not interfere with them. They want them to thrive. They want to interfere with their lives in a way that will make their lives better, and they will exert their capabilities. So that's kind
yeah,
of I came across that concept. I thought that was a very good concept to interact with nature. It's complex because you kind of play God, and that might be side effects. So you're just saying like feed the lions with different sort of food. Is that an ethical thing to do? I'm not sure. It's very difficult to respond to that question.
yeah.
I
And I think
consider it
one
to be.
one way of cutting through it, and one way I think the capabilities approach can be quite interesting because, it focuses on recognizing that all sentient beings matter, but then it says, okay, but different sentient beings have different capabilities, things they can and they want to do. It can be a way into what I think is the moral foundation here, which is in a good faith way, genuinely doing our best to try and imagine what it's like to be those other beings, humans or not, what they
Yeah,
want.
curiosity. She says that you should
Yeah,
approach it
what
with
what they
curiosity.
genuinely want, right? If imagine you could have a telepathic connection with not just with the lion, but also with the antelopes they eat, and they would tell you what they wanted, right? And I think we can make some decent guesses at what they would want, right? In some cases, that leads us to a really easy, obvious, direct win-win-win. In other cases, like the lion and the antelope, there's a difficult choice to make, right? Because you think, well, here's what the lion wants to do, right? You could feed them cultivated meat, maybe, and maybe the lion would say, this is awesome because I don't have to run around hunting anymore. It's really tiring. It's high risk. It's really stressful. I get really hungry for weeks in between a kill, right? So this is awesome. Or they might say, you know, no, actually, my nature is to hunt, to chase, I need, so I don't know
They're
what
kind
they'd
of
say.
hardwired into doing that. I
Yeah,
might be
and I
betting.
don't know what they'd say, right? But you can this will sound really silly to people, right? But I genuinely think this is the type of thinking we need to be trying to do, right? As we do with intrahuman ethics. If I really care about you, I need to try and think about who you are and what you want and what makes you happy and what makes you sad, right? But I think the one thing that would be pretty clear when you imagine the antelopes that the lion will kill through their life, pretty clear. They don't want the stress. They don't want to be chased. They don't want to see their family eaten alive in front of them, right? So, and then you have to do ethics, right? And you have to weigh stuff up, and then you also have to layer in the idea about, you know, do we have an obligation to intervene, or is there something about nature that means we should keep it completely separate? Are there, even if we intervene in a way that we think is benevolent, are there knock-on impacts? Are we destroying ecosystems? Could we be causing harms? I mean, again, no idea, right? But there's so much complexity to work through. But the baseline core is all of the sentient beings matter, and we should, to the extent we can, have a good faith attempt to understand what their genuine interests are and try and act with those in mind, right? And the
Yeah,
fortunate thing is, there's so many difficult problems in the wild animal space, but there are some really, 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 really easy things like animal agriculture where the answer ethically and morally is staring us in the face, and ultimately it is a win-win-win. So, and I think that's partly why so much of the animal movement obviously concentrates there, because it's such an obvious problem with such an obvious solution. It's one that we are, as a species, perpetuating every day, basically needlessly. So it's an understandable focus, right?
Yeah, yeah, it start focusing on the easy things to solve, then we go on to
Yeah, and
the
I don't.
next
When
ones.
I say it's easy, I don't want to pretend it's, there aren't transitions that are required, and there aren't massive systemic shifts required, and it isn't, psychologically and socially difficult for people because of their identity connections with some of these systems and these processes and these products. I don't want to, pretend that's not complex. But the basics are really simple because we already have ready alternatives that are at scale today, probably 3 or 4 times more scale than we need for even the peak level of human population. So the basics are there, right? We don't need to have crazy new inventions or, it really is just a practical question of transition to a solution we already have up and running.
Yeah. It's what makes the most sense to interfere with, and probably what is like glaringly causing more harm to other sentient beings. I
Yeah, and
just
we
in the
already
beginning
we
of
already today produce probably 3 or 4 times more plant-based nutrition than we need to feed 12 billion humans, and the UN thinks we'll top out at 11. So, and that's today, right? It's already there,
yeah, yeah, I didn't know that information, but
roughly. Yeah,
there we go, evidence and reason to base our thoughts.
exactly.
So
Yeah, we're just feeding nearly all of that, or vast amount of that plant-based nutrition through animals, losing 90 to 95% of it, and killing them along the way. So let's stop
yeah, so
that.
yeah, so one last question before I go on about what initiative fiction for sustainability will be. Uh, did you, while reading the book, felt like or even thought that the Jacksons were sentientists? Did you have that impression?
It seemed to be a factor, right? They did at some points consider that these human beings seem to have experiences. So it did seem to be a factor. Um, the it didn't seem to be the only factor because they were also thinking about you know the attitudes and the behaviors of humans and whether they were destroying the planet they were on. So they were also thinking, well, are they sentient? But then also, are they a force for good or bad?
Yeah,
Generally. So there was something about their intellect and their attitude, and which again is similar to how we think sometimes amongst human ethics. We'll say, well, okay, they're a sentient being, but they're a bad person, so they deserve to be punished, right? Which we could get into. So there was a bit of that thinking going on. It was like, okay, they're sentient, but they look quite dangerous. Um,
yeah,
and I think
yep,
that the other difference was on the flip side when you're thinking about the justifications, because interestingly, I think the Jacksons seem to have some more difficult justifications to work through, right? They genuinely were really struggling with their own health and their own nutrition and had seemed to have, limited other options. So there did seem to be a bit more of a, if not a decent justification, at least a hint of more necessity that was driving their thinking about whether they should farm humans or not. Whereas in the human space, I just don't think those arguments are there at all, right? So that was one difference for me. It felt like the Jacksons had a slightly tougher ethical question in front of them than we do as humans.
yeah.
You were almost being, yeah,
When making them, I kind of inspired myself on utilitarian worldview. So that would be why they would be like, oh, but they're causing more harm to the other beings on Earth, and they care about all the beings in a non-hierarchical manner. So why should they care about the humans? But at the same time, they care about sentience, and they are struggling to understand whether or not they are sentient, which is kind of something that sentientism doesn't go into, like determining who is and who is not. It's just say that follow evidence and reason.
yeah,
So they're kind of trying to struggle with that. So that's what I say. Even if you follow evidence and reason, it doesn't mean that you will achieve the reality, what the world is like. Even if you are like, evidence might tell us something totally different from what reality what actually looks like. And further down the line, you may figure out that you were kind of doing everything upside down. So yeah,
yeah, yeah. The key is you never
it's
stop, that you're always
yeah,
open to self-correction. And I
yeah.
think that's
So
it, and that can be a really important thing because sometimes people will say, well, this evidence and reason thing is sort of obvious. Doesn't everybody do it? And it's like, well, sort of, but there are alternatives, right? So there is fideism, which is taking a faith-based approach where you don't base your belief on evidence and reason. There is a dogmatic approach where your beliefs and credences won't change based on evidence and reason, and they're often related. There's a revelation or a sort of unquestioned revelation. So I could have a personal experience now that, maybe one of my ancestors is talking to me, or I get a message from God, and if I don't question or challenge that and look for corroborating evidence, and I just say, well, that now is my reality, that's sort of using an unchallenged revelatory approach to my beliefs, or deference to an authority figure, right? So if Vladimir Putin or the Pope or somebody else says this is the way it's going to be, and I just, without challenging it,
Just
without looking for corroboration, just accept it because it's an authority or because it was in the Quran or the Bible, that's an authority-based epistemology. So those are some different alternatives to using evidence and reason, if that makes sense. And interestingly, some people will use evidence and reason and still end up with a somewhat supernatural worldview because they will say to me, look, I've used evidence and reasoning and I've got to this.
yeah.
And that's fine, right? Because at least we can then have a conversation about the quality of their evidence, and we can reason together, and we have a language we can work together on trying to work that stuff out. But almost as big a problem is people who say they're using evidence and reason but do it badly, because you can say I'm using evidence and reason, but I only look for evidence that supports the beliefs I already hold, and then I reason in a backwards sense to justify the things I want to believe. So a really
Yeah.
classic example of this is pseudoscience, right? And grifters who will use evidence and reason type language and scientific style language, but actually they're using it to convince people and themselves of something they desperately want to believe already, rather than doing evidence and reason well, which is a genuine, good faith, humble, open minded, always self correcting approach to
And
understanding
it's not
things.
always that it will be easy to identify pseudoscience. Even if you're someone who puts a lot of effort in trying to verify your facts and information, it can be that you will fall in the trap of some pseudoscience going out there. And
Completely.
even
And if
science
you
itself,
and the one risk is if you think, okay, this means I need to do the evidence and reasoning myself in every topic, in every domain, you will fail, right? Because
yeah, it's
no
not
one can be
realistic.
expert in all of that. In real life, for most of our beliefs, what we need to do is use evidence and reason to work out who to trust, which institutions and which individuals to trust, and then based on
Because
the
of a
quality,
track record.
yeah, and because of the quality of their evidence and reasoning. And again, we should do that provisionally and probabilistically as well, because if someone we thought we trusted or an institution we thought we trusted goes off the rails and then doesn't self-correct, again, we should. But it's
Yeah.
more that indirect belief and credences rather than just thinking. The classic problem is do your own research, right? Which in practical terms mean, you know, go to my YouTube and listen to just the shit I tell you, right? And don't look at established science, right? Doing your own research, for most people leads them into bad places, right? So a
Yeah.
genuine
So yeah,
epistemology is also about appropriate trust and conditional trust of others.
that that sets a real problem, because even if we establish that we agree that we will base our moral compass on evidence and reason, it might be that we are looking at totally different evidence and reason, and
Yeah.
you're reaching like different points. So yeah, but
Exactly, and I
that's a
think that's part of doing it well is not to over select which evidence you look at. And if you encounter someone with different beliefs because you're both using different evidence sets, then you need to look at each other's evidence sets and work that through. And I think the other point is the evidence and reason in sentientism isn't just about how we then apply that to morality. It's also independently about trying to come up with decent beliefs and credences in their own right. So sentientism says we should use evidence and reason to work out, does this mug exist in front of me? Or is gravity a force or the curvature of space-time? Or, whatever it is, any single belief or credence, we should use evidence and reason to work out, not just in the moral questions, if that makes sense.
yeah, not just out of faith as well. So
Yeah, yeah.
you shouldn't ever come from faith. Which I don't
Not,
know if
yeah.
we'll have time to discuss it, but it's something that I would be curious about. How do you receive people that are engaging with sentientism, that they come from a total different pathway? They come from faith and belief system that's totally different, because it might happen, because
Yeah.
it
Oh, that happens all the
ultimately,
time. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, it might happen a lot, because it kind of, people will want to identify it because they identify with the animal cause, and they are often coming from a totally different place. So how do you interact with it? Not sure.
It's
Like
well,
it's
yeah, no, I mean,
difficult.
I know it's a brilliant question and a really important one. So practically all of our groups and forums and communities and everything are completely open to anyone interested in these ideas. So it's not like some club where you have to sign up to join as a sentientist, right? So we have loads of people with religious or supernatural worldviews, and we have people who disagree with the sentiocentric stance as well. For also, so the groups and the communities and the thinking is all completely open, and as we hinted at earlier on, we can absolutely work in common cause, side by side in solidarity with everybody who's trying to build a better world for all sentient beings, whether they're motivated by ahimsa or Christian stewardship or the Islamic virtues of Rama and compassion, or I think that I've got the word right there, or a more naturalistic approach, right? So we should work together on doing good things in the world, regardless of our belief systems. So I would make that totally and utterly clear.
Yeah.
And I've interviewed quite a lot of people who come from a religious background themselves as well, Hindus and Muslims and Christians. And I guess the two questions I tend to ask are, I'm less interested in the specific beliefs that they hold, but I'm interested in if they have a religious belief, is it based on evidence and reason? Have they thought through the evidence and the reasoning, which might be reading the Bible or looking for evidence of miracles or something else, and come to a rational conclusion that this is what I should believe? And if the evidence changes, will they change their mind? Or is it more a faith-based thing where, because of the way they've been brought up and because of a certain nature of religious commitment, that they say, well, no, it is about faith? And that's quite an interesting distinction because people can answer in lots of different ways. And my worry about faith is that I think there's a risk of it being arbitrary because by definition, it's not connected to the evidence and reason of the real world. And if a belief is arbitrary, it could be right, but it's extremely unlikely to be right. Whereas I think if we use information from reality, we're more likely to have decent
Yeah,
credences about
the
the reality.
flexibility is kind of necessary because it might be that you will completely change your view just because you might find better
Well,
evidence, and
well, it's
it might be that you will not be connected to
and that's
that
another good
worldview
point, right?
anymore.
But I think it's two separate things. One is the belief in the first place is arbitrary, and two, if it's held dogmatically, it can never be changed. And I think both of
Yeah.
those are issues, right? But then you can almost put that to one side and come on to the ethical question, which is the main reason I'm concerned about non-naturalistic epistemologies, right? Faith or revelation or authority. One is I just think they're less likely to be true, right? To lead you to good beliefs or accurate credences. But it's because of the potential ethical knock-on impacts, because even really compassionate people can do bad things if they're wrong about the world. Right. So there's a really interesting example of a terrible situation that happened recently in Kenya, where a preacher convinced a community of people that the way to salvation was to go into the forest and starve themselves and their children to death. Right. Now, I don't know what's going on in that guy's head, and I don't know what's going on in the head of his followers, but I would guess that they cared about each other genuinely, right? They were probably good people, compassionate people, but they believed things that were fundamentally untrue that led to deep
Yeah.
deep ethical horrors, right? So that's the other reason why I'm really interested in epistemologies, because it can have bad ethical impacts. And that's just a terrible example. There are loads of others that aren't that bad. So the other part of the conversation I have with people is, even if you have a faith-based way of understanding the world, how can we guard against that being used to justify discriminations or needless harms to others, to other humans and to other non-human sentient beings? And fascinatingly, one thing you'll find is that even in faith-based communities and communities that do seem to have, quite hard beliefs that you're not supposed to change because they're in the Bible or the Quran or the, lessons from the Bhagavad Gita or whatever, within those communities, there are always large groups of people who are developing broadly progressive, more justice based ethics, even in that context. And they are finding ways to, get closer to a sort of genuinely compassionate, naturalistic, grounded ethics that is against discrimination, that is against needless harm, even within a worldview that is framed by faith or authority. And I find that fascinating and totally encouraging. And, I find solidarity with them. So if someone says, I have a faith-based worldview that has led me to see homosexuality as an abomination, all right, there's I have two issues, right? One, you've got a faith-based way of understanding the world, and two, more importantly, it's led you to a completely ungrounded, disgusting discrimination that might lead you to actually cause harm in the real world, right? So, I might respect your right to have a belief, but I will not respect your right to, push homophobia in the world, right? And certainly not to act on that. Does that make sense? Someone
Yeah,
else will
yeah,
say, I have the same basically foundational belief, but actually, because of my intuitive human compassionate ethics, I reject all forms of intrahuman discrimination, sexism, racism, transphobia, homophobia, casteism, classism, right? All human beings matter. And ideally, all sentient beings matter. And even though the worldview they come from might have the same name, they've ended up in a very difficult ethical position, or a very different ethical position. And the latter, I encourage and I have solidarity with, and we work together just as we might do on the non-human causes.
yeah. The dogmatic thing might be the most difficult to deal with because it is will shape the person to not actually change their point of view. So they will be too strict to a certain worldview, and they won't kind of make renew their view to a more modernized version. So yeah, you can definitely. But what I consider the best of this, and it kind of gives me hope of this movement growing, is that you are trying to be inclusive rather than exclusive, and
Completely, completely.
you will often find those movements like veganism or whichever ism that you find out there to be trying to like we are trying to make a better world, but you have to be this certain way so that you are part of this movement. You are now one of the good people trying to improve the world. So by being inclusive, you are trying to get people together rather than being exclusive and creating this bubble effect. So
Yeah,
I
but
was
at the same time, there are limits, right? And they are moral and ethical limits. So if people engage in our groups in ways that are harmful to others in the group, um, we will of course like take sensible moderation actions to manage that. So there's a very open, there's a rich openness about different ways of thinking and different ways of believing and so on. But if you're actually harming others in the community, there are lines that we need to draw, right?
yeah, sure. And I've seen some of that in the groups recently, even though I'm there for 2 months.
Yeah, and
A little
one of the
less
things I
than that.
love about it is that I've been absolutely amazed at how little of that there is. Right, given
Yeah,
we have people in our groups from over 100 countries, from every conceivable background and different worldviews, um, I would like to hope that even the people who disagree with sentientism do come with some sense of universal compassion that they also express to those they're talking to online in our in our group. So I hope that's why we see very little of that. We see some very difficult disagreements and we see some quite fiery debates, but it's been so rare to actually find,
the
you know,
I told you
uncompassionate or harmful behavior.
I I consider the debates to be high level and polite, even though there was disagreement there that they were kind of coming from trying to like make themselves heard in a polite and well articulated manner. So yeah, let me just go on the initiative and what this is all about. And I've seen on the Sentientism group someone sharing their work and trying to be reviewed. It might be that it kind of correlates with this that I'm doing, which is fiction, but basically fiction for sustainability. Why did that come about? So when I had the manuscript ready for my book, I wanted to publish it, and I started to learn about how the publishing industry works. And it's very disappointing how scammy this industry can be. So how many people are out there trying to make money over an author, like a debutant author, and they will kind of promise you all sorts of things, probably because an author will be attached to his work, so he will be emotionally vulnerable, and they will like make a significant amount of money and don't give you anything back. So I saw that the publishing industry had two kind of pathways. So once you have your book written, you start to find a literary agent, which is a very hard thing to do. This literary agent will take a long time, find a real publisher, and will publish a book that will probably pay you a small amount of money, and it will keep a small amount of the royalties of your book after this is published. This will probably take more than a year, and I would imagine that people like myself who has a manuscript ready want to publish it much more immediately than a year, to say the least. The other pathway are those hybrid publishers that will basically self-publish your work and charge you like $2,000 for you to publish it, only on things that you could do yourself. So I kind of learned how to actually publish it and how those hybrid publishers operate, just by trying to publish it, not having the resources to fall into any of those traps. And one thing that I was trying to find was that I don't want anyone special to publish my work. I just want that people that correlate with it to help me out in spreading the word, to like help me back me up. And I wanted to go onto those publishers and say, okay, we can split the royalties we make of this book, but to have it on your website and say something about it if you do like it. So this was a very difficult thing to find. So what I am doing now, if there is somebody out there that is doing fiction that correlates to sustainability with that concept, for them to reach out to me and we work together in actually making it into a book, a story. We will interior design this book. We can like outsource the cover design or think it together in a cover design, have it all ready and publish it. Co-publish it might be a possibility, or just support each other's work. So I want to maintain it very flexible for people, but I want to empower them to actually make it happen and know that there might be different alternatives than paying someone out to do very simple work for you. And there are people I know that don't have the time to actually engage with it or promote it. And I can share my experience, what's been like promoting my work. But the main thing is that you will have to find people that actually correlate with your work and want to spread it out there. So this is I have this now titled as Can Fiction Help Us Thrive? I want to make it a series. The first book, The Jacksons Debate. The next book doesn't necessarily will be the Jackson Debate 2. It can be like a different topic, talking about a different sort of issue within sustainability that we can work together. I'm now talking to 2 or 3 authors, and it will all take place on Substack. This podcast will be published on Substack, and I hope there will be more joining us. How do you
Sounds
feel
good. Yeah.
about it? Yeah.
Yeah. Very good luck. Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things we've done in the sentientism communities is we're thinking through all of the implications of this worldview for every area of human endeavor. So you can rewrite the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for sentient rights. You can rethink the Sustainable Development Goals with a sentientist perspective. You can think through how it might change economics and politics and law and democracy, agriculture, obviously, environmentalism. But one of the other areas we've included in there is sentientist language and sentientist culture. And it's really fascinating to look at where there are films or fiction or sci-fi is a great example where people have already been exploring some of these sentientist themes about, you know, a scientific understanding of the world more broadly, but also a sentiocentric compassion that recognizes sentience matters, has it, and wherever they have it, and whatever sentience is. So yeah, I'm really encouraged to see any sort of exploration of the fiction space that tests out some of these ideas and puts them into practice.
Yeah, I do consider my book specifically to be a sententist type of book, even though we haven't overall agreed that the Jacksons are scientists, but they definitely have some background in scientism, sure. And you have it listed on the
Yeah.
scientism book club on Goodreads, so I much appreciate that. I do feel like it at least correlates with the concept. So yeah, I'm looking forward to having more scientist type of books on this under this banner.
Yeah, sounds good. And I'm at the early stages of thinking about a book about sentientism and its implications as well. So I might need your advice about the difficulties of the publishing industry. But
Yeah, it's very difficult. Yeah, the worst part is that there will be loads of people that will come to you pretending to be your friend, and you are actually just trying to take the money out of you. So yeah, that that's very difficult to deal with. But
fair warning,
anyway,
yeah.
yeah. So but it's kind of a good thing because from there. Like I just wanted to write a book and have it out there, and it ended up that I figured out a space in which I consider to be problematic. So why not to try to solve it? It can be a good thing for me. It can be a good thing for other people out there.
Yeah. And now
It's just an
you are a
industry.
published author. Yeah.
Yeah, and I am now. Yeah, and I'm now in conversations with Elsevier, the academic publisher, to have a shorter version of the story published. So I'll probably like it's very difficult to do because she wants to have 5,000 words. She kind of like the story as a whole, but how will I, and I have to streamline it. But by being an author, you kind of get attached to everything within the story, and you don't want to remove anything. And I was like, I'll take this chapter out, and I was but that was so important to the story development, I couldn't take it
Yeah.
out.
You almost need to
So I kind
rewrite it as a short story. Yeah.
yeah, it's very difficult thing to do. Like and the emotional attachment, it's something that you have to keep yourself like even though you will be emotionally attached to your work, you have to be keep yourself sober to people that are trying to scam you because they will try to exploit it, which is a very bad thing to happen. But anyway,
Yeah.
this is how the world works.
Yeah. Well, very
Okay,
good luck with the next stage.
yeah, I think that we made it 1 hour and a half, very long podcast.
Yeah.
But thank
And I
you.
just encourage, before we finish, I just encourage anyone to, if who, they're interested in this sentientism idea, if they just look for the word, it's sentient with ism on the end. Search for it anywhere, you'll find us. We have online communities. There's our own podcast on
Yeah,
YouTube. I'd love to continue the conversation. So yeah, just reach out.
I'll have it linked on the Substack. It will be so. I'm just like this is the debut podcast. It will kind of represent the initiation of the project. I'll have the book there, some articles about the creation of the book. I'll probably have the Goodreads listing for Sentientism, and with it the Sentientist Substack, the Facebook page,
Brilliant.
and every other space that people
Yeah.
will
Thank
want
you.
to
Thank you
engage
so
with.
much.
Because I find it everywhere. So if I go on Instagram, I find it's out there. It's on Threads also.
Yeah. Pretty much
Yeah, but
everywhere.
I just
Mastodon, Blue Sky, yeah,
yeah,
Facebook, yeah,
and
Discord, Signal,
fantastic.
Telegram, yeah.
Everywhere. So I don't even follow all the
Yeah, there's
because I
no
don't even
escape.
have this all those social media. So it's perpetuated in all social media at this moment. So it's very easy to find. Okay, so thank you.